So Luocha's coffin contains a fragment of the true body of the Aeon, Tayzzyronth. That's unexpected. I mean, I didn't even realize Aeons had physical bodies. I kind of thought they were like these ghostly energy entities or something, kind of floating in space, but like not actually. And now I gotta reassess my whole worldview. But before I do that, I would very much like to know exactly what Luocha and his co-conspirators are trying to do with this fragment of Tayzzyronth. Like, I know we were told that this fragment is the key to bringing down Yaosha as part of their Godslayer protocol plan, but like, how exactly? I am in great need of answers. So I went looking for them, and what did I find? Nonsense. Absolute and utter nonsense. Because if my investigation results are accurate, then this plan has a very misleading name because it's not about slaying gods at all. And actually, Luocha even tells us as much, which was a very confusing thing to read early on in my investigation, but the more I dug, the more I understood what he meant and what this plan truly entails. And if everything goes according to my calculations, which I admit are sketchy at best, then we may witness not only the death of an Aeon, but the birth of another. Intrigued? Then grab a seat because it is time to talk about what this so-called Godslayer protocol plan is and what we can learn from the Aeons involved and what Jingliu, Ruanmei, and Luocha's presumed alliance can tell us about how this plan might work. And as with any good theory, we gotta start things off with some context. So let's turn our attention to the two primary Aeons involved in this plan, Yaosha and Tayzzyronth. I think most people should be pretty familiar with Tayzzyronth at this point, but just in case you're not, Tayzzyronth was born on the insect planet of Lepismet as a coleoptera. That's just a fancy word for beetles, which is one of the reasons why the path of propagation is very bug-themed. Now, Lepismet was eventually wiped out by bounty hunters, and as the sole survivor of their race, Tayzzyronth was consumed with such intense loneliness that they ascended to Aeonhood, splitting the pre-existing path of permanence in order to create the new path of propagation. And soon after that, they created the Swarm. And for those of you who forgot, the permanence is the path of the presumed dead Aeon named Long, the dragon that created the Videodora. Long and the permanence will play a larger role later on, so keep it in mind. Tayzzyronth's swarm began to spread throughout the universe like a plague, consuming entire worlds in the pursuit of perpetual reproduction. And the damage caused was so incredible that it caught the attention and concern of the other Aeons. As far as the other Aeons were concerned, Tayzzyronth's prolific replication disrupted the equilibrium of the cosmos and thus broke the rules. To put an end to this disaster, Enna the Order approached Qlipoth the Preservation with a plan to neutralize Tayzzyronth. What this plan entailed is a little unclear, but based on what we do know, my understanding is that Enna allowed themselves and their path to be assimilated into the new Aeon Xipe and their path the Harmony. Xipe could then create an opening for Qlipoth to do whatever it was that Qlipoth needed to do, which apparently was just smashing Tayzzyronth over and over again with his big hammer like a very angry person smashes a fly with a fly swatter. And when Qlipoth was finally done smashing Tayzzyronth, they sealed the remains of Tayzzyronth in amber, which halted or at least slowed the spread of the swarm. The swarm still remained and could replicate on their own, but they no longer replicated with the incredible speed and fervor that they had when Tayzzyronth was still around. Tayzzyronth's remains that were trapped in the amber were hidden somewhere in the depths of space, and as far as I know, no one really knows where this location ended up being, and I'm not really sure if the recovered fragment of the body was retrieved from the amber prison or if it was discovered elsewhere, kind of like a piece that didn't get encapsulated. Now, you might have noticed that this story has almost nothing to do with Yaosha, and yet Luocha and Co want to use a fragment of Tayzzyronth's body in order to kill Yaosha specifically. So you might be wondering what the connection between the two is. Why is a fragment of Tayzzyronth specifically needed to kill Yaosha? Well, in order to answer that question, let's go over what we do know about how to kill an Aeon. Most of what we know about killing an Aeon comes from Kafka, who claims that there are 3 different methods, but she only ends up explaining 2 of them. So I'm going to ignore the existence of this 3rd one for right now, even though it could be the most likely method given how secretive they're being about it. But anything I say about it would be pretty baseless, and that's also not very helpful. So for our purposes, there are 2 methods. The first way of killing an Aeon is to have another Aeon kill it for you. Kafka then cites the battle between Qlipoth and Tayzzyronth here as an example, which I think is a little bit misleading because we know that Tayzzyronth isn't really dead, just trapped in amber. But I don't want to completely write off this option because otherwise the existence of the hunt is rather confusing since Lan ascended based on the desire to kill Yaosha. And if killing Yaosha was impossible, then I question Lan's existence. So I think this method likely works, but it would be incredibly difficult difficult for a normal person to leverage this because it would mean convincing an Aeon to fight another Aeon, and I don't know how you would do that. Now, we do have the fragment of the body of an Aeon, and I don't know, maybe the properties of that fragment have some sort of necessary makeup that could harm another Aeon? But this seems unlikely because unless the Luocha Co have some crazy plan to use the fragment as like some kind of cosmic harpoon gun that they want to shoot Yaosha with, I don't really think this is how the Godslayer protocol plan will go down. Unless the idea here is to leverage the skills of a mad scientist to use the fragment as like a framework to build a new body for the deceased Aeon. That would mean that Luocha Co have like some sort of agreement with Tayzzyronth, make them a new body, and they will kill Yaosha. Ruan Mei's presence on the Luofu and her involvement in this Godslayer protocol plan makes the possibility of this more likely, if only because we've seen her try to revive one of Tayzzyronth's emanators before. So if anyone could revive an Aeon, I'd bet it would be her. But I'm not really sold on this idea because reviving Tayzzyronth comes with the horrifying risk of a second swarm disaster, and that would doom everybody. So while I do think this is a reasonable possibility, I'm not particularly keen on the idea. So let's move on to method number 2 for killing an Aeon. This method is more of a death on a technicality. So Kafka says that when an Aeon's path collides with that of another Aeon, the broader path absorbs the narrower one, which results in the death of the Aeon that governed the narrower path. This is what happened with Enna as their path of order was absorbed by Shipei's broader path of harmony. And this is what I think the Godslayer protocol is really all about. Not necessarily killing an Aeon outright, but forcing their paths to collide and having one of them die as a consequence. If you're wondering why I think they're not just going to kill them outright, it's because Luocha tells Jingyuan that the very idea of killing an Aeon outright is laughable, if not impossible, which is part of the reason why I think the name of the plan is a little misleading. Luocha follows this statement by saying, quote, "To sever Yaosha's curse, one must look to the source for a different solution." So in my opinion, the goal of the Godslayer protocol isn't to kill an Aeon directly, but to fix the issue surrounding Yaosha's blessing. And if I'm right about the methodology, it seems as though Luocha and his co-conspirators believe that a collision between the paths of Yaosha and Tayzzyronth would solve this problem. We'll talk about why I think this would solve the problem in a minute, but for this plan to even work, the paths of the Aeons involved have to overlap conceptually. Otherwise, they will never be on a collision course. And as luck would have it, propagation and abundance are, in fact, overlapping concepts. Now, it's not as obvious in English, but in Chinese, propagation is actually called breeding, and abundance is called fertility. And before you get on my case about the translation, just know that these names were also present in the English closed beta tests and were only changed later on, probably because in English they sounded a little silly. Now, I don't think I need to elaborate on how or why these paths are connected, but I will note that in the Destructions devlog 1, Herta outright states that abundance and propagation overlap. Now, do note that the assimilation of one path into another might be slightly more akin to a fusion process. In Simulated Universe Swarm Disaster, Aha commented that Enna became Shipei in a way, and Enna appears to have changed Shipei's appearance after they were assimilated. So Shipei may be the dominant aspect of this fusion, but it seems like Enna's powers became a part of theirs, so the power of order became an aspect of the power of harmony. Following this logic, if we look at Tayzzyronth and Yaosha, we should expect something similar to occur if their paths collide. The only question is, which path is actually the broader one? Will Yaosha absorb Tayzzyronth, or will Tayzzyronth absorb Yaosha? This question's actually a little misleading on my part, because I don't think it actually matters which one absorbs the other one hypothetically, because I don't think it's actually going to be either of them. I think there is a third option. And the reason is, based on what Luocha said, this fusion should solve the issue around Yaosha's curses. And I don't know about you, but I find it impossible to imagine how propagation being added into the abundance would actually fix this problem that they have of their faulty immortality. Like, how would this help with being Mara-struck? And that's just it. I don't think it will. If the fusion of Yaosha and Tayzzyronth would just result in one of them becoming the dominant Aeon. which, if you've picked up on my tone, is not what I think is actually going to happen. See, the issue of Yaosha's curses is that their version of immortality is faulty and flawed. But we do have an example of a species that doesn't have that problem when it comes to immortality. And that species is the Vidyadhara, Long's scions. Long being the Aeon of permanence. Now this is about to get a little bit weird, but do you remember how Tayzzyronth ascended to Aeonhood? They split Long's path of permanence and created a new path of propagation from it. They created a narrower path from a broader one. This is the opposite of what happened between Enna and Xipe, where Enna's narrower path was assimilated into Xipe's broader one. And that got me wondering, if permanence could be split into propagation, then what happened to the part of the path that didn't become the propagation? Is it possible that it became the path of abundance? Now, it seems like a weird question to ask, I know, but there is a reason I'm asking it. In Simulated Universe's Swarm Disaster, Herta and Screwlum made a bet on whether or not Yaosha even existed during the era of the Swarm. Screwlum believed, quote, there are possible relations between abundance and propagation, while Herta believed that Yaosha did not exist in that time period. By the end of this bet, Screwlum concludes that indeed Yaosha did not yet exist, but he makes no comment about the path of abundance existing or not. And I feel like this is a bit of an important detail, because when Qlipoth goes to smash Tayzzyronth and trap them in amber, the process is described in a rather peculiar way. It says that the propagation is being diluted and a second concept is being extracted. A second concept being extracted during the dilution of the propagation sure sounds like a new path was then created, since paths are basically concepts. And not only that, but this path would have an overlapping concept, which leads me to believe that this path would have been the path of the abundance. That would make both propagation and abundance not only related to each other, but also related to permanence. Now, this passage is a little sparse on the details, but I am wondering if Qlipoth didn't so much split abundance from propagation, as it kind of reads, but instead split abundance from permanence by tampering with propagation's path. I don't really know how this would work, but the idea that permanence and abundance both focus on immortality and permanence currently lacks the concept of breeding makes me think that the collision of abundance and propagation would actually result in the reconstruction of the permanence. If I'm right and this is what the Godslayer Protocol is, not a method to revive Tayzzyronth or kill Yaosha, but instead one to revive Long and restore the path of permanence by forcing the paths of abundance and propagation to collide, that would solve a lot of problems. If Yaosha was to be absorbed by Long, then the Xianzhou would theoretically no longer bear the burden of Yaosha's blessing. Instead, they should be getting Long's blessing, which would mean that their form of immortality switches from having to inevitably be Mara-struck to being something more akin to what the Vidyadhara go through. So instead of having to fear becoming Mara-struck and basically becoming the walking undead, instead their bodies would melt down into a liquefied goo and they would undergo a sort of reset on their life. And on the other hand, propagation being reabsorbed back into the path of permanence may solve the problem that the Vidyadhara face when it comes to not being able to reproduce anymore, because, they might lack the concept of breeding. So when Luocha was talking about looking to the source of the problem, he may have been referring to the Swarm Disaster. It was preceded by the disappearance of Long and followed by the splitting of the path of permanence, the loss of the Vidyadhara's ability to reproduce, and the curses of Yaosha. And if we think about the abundance and propagation as being subsections of the permanence, it might explain why the Vidyadhara are the ones guarding Yaosha's plague marks. Who better to guard the symbols of these curses of immortality than the ones who walk the broader version of that path? Now, you may still be thinking that the previous theory I pitched about trying to revive Tayzzyronth instead and having them fight Yaosha is more plausible because of Ruan Mei's involvement. And that's kind of where I have to disagree. I think Ruan Mei's involvement with this plan makes path collision and the revival of Long a lot more probable. I feel like this gets glossed over a bit when it comes to her, but Ruan Mei is obsessed with trying to understand the, quote, fundamental essence of life. She wants to know why life exists, what causes it, where it starts, and where it ends. And this relentless pursuit of hers has led her to study the Aeons themselves because she believes that they may hold the answers she seeks. This is partly why she agreed to to participate in Herta's simulated universe project. It's one of the best ways to study the Aeons. And it also might be why she went through the trouble of reviving Ting Yun. And this interest in the fundamental essence of life may also suggest that she has an interest in the Vidyadhara and their Aeon, and not just because there's an opportunity to witness the birth of an Aeon through this Godslayer Protocol project. See, of all the Aeons, Long was the one that seems to have understood the concepts behind the fundamental essence of life best, because alongside this cyclical version of immortality that seemingly has very few downsides compared to the alternatives, Long also blessed the Vidyadhara with the power of cellular manipulation, or rather, the transmutation of life forms. According to a Vidyadhara youth's notes, Vidyadhara used to be able to change the form of any creature in any way they liked to suit their whims. They could give crabs thousands of legs if they wanted to, or change the flavor profile of vegetation, or even force life forms to replicate at will. But due to unknown reasons, they no longer possess this ability, and it seems kind of similar to how they lost their ability to reproduce. I just can't shake the feeling that the suddenness of these losses is somehow related to Long. Now imagine Ruan Mei being pitched a plan to not just witness the rebirth of an Aeon, which would already be a dream project, but to also witness the rebirth of an Aeon that specifically governs over the creation, preservation, and manipulation of life itself. The one topic that dominates her life. There's no way she'd refuse. It's literally her dream project. We may have even witnessed one of her test runs. Cause you remember how she tried to revive an emanator of Tayzzyronth's swarm in her lab? There may have been more to it than just curiosity. As for why I think that, how do I explain this? Okay, listen. I think Long was actually a Leviathan originally. The reason being is that Leviathans are commonly considered to be dragons, and it's not unheard of for a Leviathan in Star Rail to be reclassified later as an Aeon. We know that this is the case with Ouroboros the Veracity. Plus, Long appears to be as old as, if not older than, both Qliphoth and Enna, who are among the oldest of the known Aeons. Literally the only entities older than them are the Leviathans. But the dragon thing isn't the only reason why I'm looking at him being like, yeah, you might be an Aeon. Cause recently, Himiko and Welt delivered pieces of a deceased Leviathan to Ruan Mei, and we were never told why. Now, I don't know about you, but all these pieces and the timing line up pretty well. Ruan Mei could be studying the Leviathan remains to better understand Long's nature, or to even use it as scaffolding to create an entity that could ascend the path of permanence once the path of abundance and propagation collide. And I could sit here and argue that the reason why Ruan Mei, Luocha, and Jingliu are petitioning the Xianzhou for aid with the Godslayer Protocol plan is because the Xianzhou is the new home of the Vidyadhara, and the Vidyadhara are Long's scions, and they're trying to revive Long. But I also think that part of the Godslayer plan is trying to find a means by which to actually instigate this path collision. And if Yao Guang's words are anything to go by, then there might be some challenges in even instigating the path collision, and those challenges may involve fighting the gods themselves in some way, shape, or form. And for that, you're gonna need an army. And the Xianzhou is the most perfect option for an army that you could get for this exact scenario. And that, my friends, is my bonkers take on what the Godslayer Protocol plan actually is. Even if it ends up not being correct, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Now, while we say thank you to all of my wonderful enablers who are also called channel members, who are scrolling across the screen right now, I do have one last thing to share that doesn't really belong anywhere else in this theory, although it is related. And that has to do with the possible third way to kill an Aeon that Kafka never elaborated on. I just gotta warn you that the reason why I didn't put this in the theory is that it's based entirely on vibes and nothing else. I think based on nothing but vibes that the third method of killing an Aeon is not actually killing it again, but instead waiting for an Aeon to willingly descend from the rank of Aeonhood to that of Pathstrider. So like a god becoming a mortal. The logic being that if it is possible for a normal individual to ascend to the highest point of a path, then why couldn't they descend to become immortal once again? Like, I'm sure there would be some losses in terms of power or knowledge or anything like that along the way, but I don't think it's totally impossible, especially when we're talking about Long. Like, Long seems to have understood the true essence of life better than anything in existence thus far, so part of me suspects that they might have reached a very unique conclusion at the end of their path. That the only true immortality in the world is cyclicality, birth and death in an endless loop, descendants carrying on the legacies of their ancestors and forging new paths and having endless new experiences. It's only through this cyclicality that one can truly experience real immortality. And if that truly is where Long ended up on their path of immortality, because remember, permanence is the path of immortality, then it's also possible that they could have concluded that to truly walk their own path would mean having to enter a state of cyclicality themselves, to ascend and descend and ascend again. And if that's the case, then I wonder if the Vidyadhara themselves are actually fragments of Long in a way. Like, there's some sort of fragmented form that Long took after descending, but once their path was split, they were unable to recombine and ascend again. Like I said, this is very speculative and based entirely on vibes, and it is most certainly not a perfect concept, but still, I think it's at least an idea worth considering and sharing. So I've done those. Your turn. And with that, I just want to thank my channel members once again for enabling my nonsensical ramblings, and thank you all for watching. I'm gonna catch y'all in the next one, so until then, I'll see you later.